And thank you all very much for coming. And as Mike was saying, I used to live here in Borsley about 15 years ago, so it's fantastic to be back here this evening. So I completed my Masters at the University of Limerick in History of the Family. I've always had an interest in genealogy, family history, and during COVID, as a way to pass the time during lockdown, I decided to research the military history of Nenagh, which I was very unfamiliar with, and particularly Nenagh military barracks. And while researching the First World War, I came across this article in 1916 about a soldier called Hennessey who was awarded the Military Cross, and a special event was held in his honour. I never heard of this soldier in the town, and being interested in genealogy, I decided to follow up on him, particularly when newspapers stated that all of his brothers were in the army and he was the son of a soldier, and I was wondering what happened to each of these men. Little did I know that 3 years research later, tracking down descendants, a pile of mysteries even here to this day, I'd uncover a lot of unknown facts about this forgotten Irish military family, the Hennesseys of County Tipperary. So who exactly were the Hennesseys? So it all began with this individual by the name of Philip Hennessey, and he was baptised on the 1st of March 1832, not actually that far away from Borsley, in the town of Roscrea, and his parents were Michael Hennessey and Bridget Lynch. And unfortunately, after research, little is actually known about Philip's early childhood or what happened to his parents and his two siblings, Margaret and James. The only confirmation is that by the mid-1870s, Michael Hennessey was deceased, and his occupation was actually a land surveyor, which must have been quite unusual at the time. Despite this, unfortunately, I've never found any more records of them. But if it was suggested, let's say Philip grew up in Roscrea at the time, it would have been during one of the darkest moments in Irish history, the famine. And it was there in Roscrea you actually had a military presence all across North Tipperary, even the Highlander regiments. And on the top right corner is what they would have looked like at the time. Perhaps seeing these guys go to the town, that kind of sense of pride, because actually the Highlanders were very well complimented by sources for being very professional soldiers, good conduct, and even showing compassion during a very difficult moment in Irish history. Even reports in Nenagh, for example, of Highlander soldiers giving whatever spare food they could to people begging outside the barrack gates. And perhaps Philip was mesmerised by the Highlander soldiers, and that's why he made the decision in 1856 to join the 75th Skirmish Regiment, which following reforms in the later 19th century became known as the Gordon Highlanders. And this actually gives you an idea of what Philip's service record looks like and is available from ancestry. So he joined at the age of 19 in Liverpool, and he was a labourer. This could suggest that possibly in his early years he might have emigrated to Liverpool for employment and then made a decision to take the Queen's shilling. And he can give his physical description, his height and all that, and it's a great source to have on ancestry. And not long after Philip joined the 75th, he was sent with detachments to India to help suppress the mutiny that had begun there when the Indian sepoys were voting against British rule. And he took part in engagements such as at Lumba, and even took part in the siege of Lucknow. And this gives you an idea of what the 75th would have looked like at the time. So following the end of the Indian Mutiny, the 75th carried out regular garrison duties across the British Empire, for instance in Gibraltar, Singapore, Hong Kong, and even in the Cape of Good Hope, which is known as South Africa. And the only engagement they took part then during that period was in 1873 in South Africa, when a tribe in Pietermaritzburg revolted, and the 75th was sent to suppress them, and that was done within 2 weeks. And like many soldiers, Philip, being in the garrison town, probably a lot of boredom in hands, decided to spend a bit of time with some local ladies in the brothel. And like many soldiers of the British Army, he was treated for venereal diseases, and the service record shows he was treated for syphilis and even gonorrhea. And following all the service, then he finally ended up back in his native country of Ireland. And he was while stationed in Newry, he became acquainted with the daughter of a blacksmith. Her name was Julia Carney. On the 1st December 1875, they got married, in St Mary's Church of Ireland, which is quite peculiar, the fact that both Philip and Julia were baptised as Catholics, and this could possibly suggest that maybe Philip converted and became anglicised while in the army in order to find it easier to adapt to that kind of lifestyle. And it's one of the main mysteries about this particular Irish family. So over the course of the next 20 years, they would have 8 children in total. And this table here gives a breakdown of all the names of the children and essentially what they went by in future records and family associations. So the first was the eldest, Gus Hennessey, who was baptised in County Louth. The next 3 sons were all baptised in what we know today as Sarsfield Barracks in Limerick. And then finally, the 4 youngest were baptised in the military barracks, were born in the military barracks in Nenagh, which is when we know that the Hennessey family finally arrived in this town. And this photograph taken in 1894 was in Nenagh, and this is only confirmed photograph of Barrack Sergeant Philip Hennessey. And he essentially ended up as a Barrack Sergeant in Nenagh, having previously served in the Louth Rifles following his transfer from the 75th, and then finally to the King's County Militia, and finally ended up as a Barrack Sergeant in Nenagh. And this is a position he held up until he suddenly died on the 24th of June 1899 from congestion of the lungs. He was only 60 years of age, and his death was quite a shock, not only to the town of Nenagh, but also to his wife, who was now left as a widow with 8 children, the oldest being 22, the youngest being 2 years of age. And times were very hard for her, as we see in the following here in the Nenagh newspaper. And this was actually an appeal done out by the local gentry and the Board of Guardians about how difficult the situation was for her. And they described that they were trying to raise funds for her so that she could start a small business so that she could bring up her children as respectable as she had done in the past prior to Philip's passing. And there was one other salvation there for the Hennessey family that certainly would have helped their sons, and that was the Royal Hibernian Military School located in Phoenix Park in Dublin. And the photograph here on the right hand side is taken from the Army and Navy Illustrated in 1899, around the time when some of the Hennessey brothers were actually attending the school, and perhaps they even among the pupils in that photograph. So what exactly was the Royal Hibernian School? So it was founded as a charity establishment in 1765 to educate the sons and daughters of soldiers. The criteria included that you had to be the children of either a deceased soldier, a soldier who was serving long-term overseas. And then in the mid-19th century, they did broaden the criteria for admission. For instance, if you were guaranteed to join the army upon completion of your education there. And even around the time when the Hennesseys joined, they were very fortunate because at that stage they had actually lightened the admission rate for Catholics, because at the time it was dominated by Protestant background, and then finally in the 1870s Catholics began to join in bigger numbers. And about 2/3 of the Hibernian pupils actually did join the regular army, and furthermore 2.5% to 4% were around the age of 14 when they joined, a lot of them being enlisted as drummers, such as Oscar Hennessey. And these are actually pictures of the drums that he had when he joined, and they are marked in the year of 1898. So the Hibernian School was discontinued in 1922 following the foundation of the Free State. All the remaining pupils were transferred to the Duke of York School in Kent, and finally they were amalgamated in 1924. And as part of the process then, all the records from the school would have been transferred to England, and unfortunately for research, most of those school records were destroyed in London following bombing during the Blitz of the Second World War. But what does survive and is digitized on Final Past is actually the admission index records. And 4 of the brothers, the youngest brothers, can be actually found on this, given the dates of when they arrived in school, the kind of qualifications such as drummer, carpenter, army volunteer, and the date of actually joining the regular army. And then other sources would feel that the eldest brothers, Gus and Bertie Hennessey, were completed their intermediate exams at the Christian Brothers School in Nenagh, next door to the military barracks, and then were accepted as pupil teachers to the Hibernian School. And then, upon completing their education there, some of the brothers would go to war for the first time. A few months after Philip died, the South African War began, which was known as the Second Anglo-Boer War. And this essentially was the Dutch Boers in South Africa that decided to fight against British rule and seek more than home rule, but even independence. And a lot of the regular army then was sent there to fight against them, including the Hennesseys. And Bertie Hennessey, despite being a pupil teacher in the school, as newspapers would later describe, he wanted the more stern life of the soldier, and he enlisted in his father's regiment, the Gordon Highlanders, along with his brothers Oscar and Edgar. And this photograph was taken probably shortly before they went to South Africa, and it was commissioned by the brother Gus, who's third on second from the right in the middle there, in a schoolmaster uniform. So all the brothers, we know from research, actually did fight together during the siege of Ladysmith, which went on for several months. And during the course of the war, 1,800 Irish men would never return from South Africa. And the war would not end until May 1902, around the time of Oscar's 20th birthday and only a week after Edgar would turn 18, just showing how young these men were upon their arrival to South Africa. And this actually is footage of the Gordon Highlanders in Ladysmith at the time, and possibly the Hennessey brothers are in that footage. And Ladysmith went on for quite a while, and it was a very challenging time for the British Army. And this was even seen in a letter written by Oscar Hennessey, who wrote to his mother in 1900 to say that when they came across the abandoned Boer camp, there was an awful scramble for the tinned meats that they left behind, because starvation was actually quite a problem with the regular army because of lack of supplies. So among with the letters that were sent home, they were published not only in the Nenagh newspapers such as the Nenagh News and the Nenagh Guardian, they were also published in the school magazine of the Hibernian School known as the Hibernia. And for anyone that is interested in reading them, they can be seen in the British Library in the off base of Yorkshire, to be ordered to view in advance, the entire collection, and then the later collection from 1917 to 1924 are available to see up in Dublin in the National Library. And the Hibernian magazine has some amazing accounts from South Africa, which was a war that I wasn't very familiar with, about what it was like for these soldiers there. And all three of the Hennessey brothers wrote letters about their time there and had it published in the magazine, on account that their brother Gus was the editor of this magazine. So for instance, on the right side, these are letters from June of 1900. Oscar, who would have been about 18 years of age, wrote about the tremendous fun they had trying to dodge the shell of the Boers in the trenches, and even a British soldier accidentally fired a shot in the trench and caused a massive landslide in mud. And they actually had a great laugh about that. And then underneath we have a letter from Bertie, who said that all he wanted over there was cigarettes and to please send him home. And even you have that sense of pride of being a soldier. For instance, in Pretoria in June of 1900, Edgar wrote to his mother that there was great honour for them, that the Highlanders were chosen to be the bodyguards for one of the highest commanders there, Lord Frederick Roberts. But the most interesting letters definitely come from the eldest one there, and that was Bertie. Bertie recalled an engagement one time of a battle where a friend of his was killed by a soldier on the other side. In retaliation, he shot that Boer soldier, and later on, when he confronted the soldier who was wounded and began to talk to him, he actually noted that they'd become quite good friends. And even in letters home, he would tell his mother, that despite what they say at home, do not think badly of the Boers, for they're actually decent fellows. And perhaps there was that Irishness coming in, and maybe that bit of understanding for the Boers about the fight for independence, but at the same time he still would be carry out his duties as a soldier. And he even mentioned about the Battle of Modder River, where a Boer soldier pretended to be wounded, and when an officer went over to him, the Boer killed him. And then, in retaliation, the British executed him for that killing. But the most poignant letter has to be in June of 1900, where Bertie says to his mother, "I know you worry for us, but cheer up and look forward to the day we can come home with medals on our breasts, knowing we've done our duty to both our Queen and country, and that we will be home soon." Sadly, that was not to be the case for Bertie. A year later, all three brothers were still in South Africa, and there was even one occasion where it was said that Bertie should have been awarded the honour of King's Corporal on account of bringing messages while under heavy fire to command, and it was only because another corporal took the credit for this that he lost it out. But Bertie was described as being of modest disposition, and being such a modest, humble soldier, he didn't actually contest this, even though he actually should have been given this special title. Then on the 6th of June 1901, at a place called Reynolds near Bloemfontein, during the Battle of Graspan, the Highlanders were ambushed by the Boers, and Bertie decided to lead a forlorn hope to try and get reinforcements. And as he was not given the fire support that he was promised, he was gunned down by the Boers. And later on, when they recovered his body, they discovered that he'd been shot 53 times, which was by coincidence the same number of engagements he'd taken part in South Africa. He was 21 years of age, and his death hit the Hennessey family very hard, and even the townspeople of Nenagh, where the Nenagh Guardian reported that his death was deeply regretted by the Christian Brothers School in Nenagh, and particularly by Reverend Fowle, as Bertie was his favourite pupil that he had. So Bertie was buried along with the other 9 Highlander soldiers killed at Reynolds in an unmarked grave in the area, but a memorial to this day, seen in the top right-hand corner, marks the place of where he was killed. Furthermore, the Hibernian School actually has a memorial for all the ex-pupils who were killed in South Africa, and he's among the 27 to have been killed in South Africa. And furthermore, in Edinburgh Castle, for anyone that's ever been there, on the outside there's a memorial to all the Highlander soldiers killed in South Africa, and I got to visit it there about a year and a half ago and find Bertie's name on that memorial. So going back then to the team of the Royal Hibernian School, so the 2 youngest brothers, Charlie and Julian Hennessey, were still pupils there, as seen on the 1901 census. And a month after Bertie was killed in South Africa, Charlie Hennessey was given a special award at the annual Crimean Prize Banquet Fund for academic excellence. And the head of the school, Commodore Call, gave tribute to Charlie's late brother Bertie for his bravery and sacrifice in South Africa. And it was observed that Charlie received the award with tears trickling down his cheek. And the people there had nothing but sympathy for him and the Hennessey family. Then 2 years later, a significant event took place at the Hibernian School, and that was the visit by King Edward VII that took place on the 23rd of July, where he presented the King's colours to the pupils. And this photograph here from the graphic gives an idea of what the event must have been like, and again, maybe Julian and Charlie Hennessey are among the pupils in that sketch. But there was one point of note, though, I discovered later on. On the 6th of August 1903, only 2 weeks after the visit, Charlie Hennessey died at the school from gastritis. In the present day, that's a treatable condition, but in the past, your chances of survival were very unlikely. He was only 13 years of age, and it is possible that the death record showed that he had been ill for about 2 weeks, that maybe on account he might have missed this one visit on medical grounds. So he was buried in the grounds of the Hibernian School, not far from the chapel where his brothers remembered on a memorial. And he's among 130 pupils that attended the school that died over its 150-year history. And the Hibernian School magazine paid tribute to his death, that he was a bright, clever, cheery boy of great character and promise. So sadly, he would not get the chance to serve in the army as his brothers would. So then we go back to the eldest brother, Gus, who did not go to South Africa. So unlike Bertie, who joined the Highlanders, he continued to complete his education at the Hibernian School. And then in 1898, he was appointed as a schoolmaster with the Education Corps. The 1901 census has him as assigned to the military barracks in Athlone. And this is most likely where he met his future wife, Margaret Ellen Mulligan, who was the daughter of an army pensioner of the Royal Artillery. And shortly afterwards in England, they got married. And then shortly again after that, Gus was appointed to be a schoolmaster over in India, where Margaret accompanied him. And between 1903 and 1905, they had 3 children, all baptized in Yancey. And then we know in the 1911 census that Gus and his wife and children came back to Ireland, where he could be found in Fort Westmoreland, which is better known as Spike Island. And one of the children in her later life wrote an unpublished memoir describing her life in Spike Island and the story of ghosts and that, and the habits of the family. And furthermore, when the family did return to India not long afterwards, to Kirta and Murray Hills, she wrote about what it was like being there and their habits and lifestyles, and even Gus and Morgan taking part in social events and plays like the HMS Pinafore. And the family would remain there, particularly during the First World War. And then these photographs here gives an account of what it was like being in India, that whole symbol of imperialism, and furthermore an Irishman being part of kind of British colonialism and that. And there's some amazing photographs of the family over there when they did their travels around there and even Afghanistan. And then we go back to Oscar Hennessey. So Oscar, at the end of the South African War, he was 20 years of age and had become a hardened battled veteran, the same as his brother Edgar. And he then, after South Africa, went to India, where he then transferred to the Bedfordshire Regiment in 1902, possibly on the promise of promotion. And he since, a few years later, was sent to Colchester, where he was the mess sergeant at the barracks there, a position he disliked, that he actually saw himself discharged from the army following the end of his 12-year engagement. But he was not done with the army. In 1909, in Kinsale, County Cork, he then joined the 1st Battalion King's Liverpool Regiment. And that's actually a photograph of him there in Fermoy Barracks in 1911. Oscar Hennessey marked in X, second row, 5th from the left. And he then, as a result, in the Edwardian period, was still in the army. But then a new significant event took place in Oscar's life. He decided to get married, and on the 30th of November 1912, he married Mary Agnes Dorn, the daughter of an army pensioner of Summerhill. And shortly after the marriage, Agnes and Oscar went to Aldershot, where the Liverpool Regiment was, and it was there in November 1913 their first child was born, Edward Charles Hennessey. So I guess the main question is, who exactly was Agnes Dorn, and how did the Dorn family fit into the story of the Hennesseys as in-laws? So it all began with Michael Dorn, who was born in the parish of Lixnaw, County Kerry in 1856. He joined the Royal Garrison Artillery in 1879. A few years later, while stationed in Kinsale, County Cork, he married Mary Cooney. And over the next decade, they would have 4 children, although only 3 of them would survive after birth. So Edward Clement Dorn was born in County Cork. Mary Agnes Dorn was born in the military barracks in Clonmel. And finally then, not too far from Borrisley, you had the birth of Frederick Walter Dorn in Teppermore. And on the 1901 census, the Dorn family could be found residing in Teppermore. And then finally, on the 30th of November 1906, Michael Dorn, as the service record shows on Ancestry, was discharged from the army after many years of service, as intended place of residence was Nenagh. And the reason for this was, on the 1911 census, he was then employed as a club steward for the North Tipperary Club, which was quite a prestigious institution in the town of Nenagh. And then regarding Nenagh and Summerhill and Dorn said, what happened to the neighbours, the Hennesseys, particularly Oscar's mother, Julia? So Julia, definitely following the death of her husband, struggled a lot. Within the space of 5 years, she'd lost not only her husband, but 2 of her sons, one in South Africa that she'd never see again, and Charlie, who died at such a young age in the Hibernian school. The 1901 census notes that she was a recipient of the British Army Allowance, and she got that as gratuity following the death of her son in South Africa. The 1911 census had no recorded occupation for her. But then, sadly, on the 9th of March 1914, at Nenagh Workhouse, she had a stroke by all accounts, as when she died, her cause of death was recorded as hemiplegia. But furthermore, her death record noted that she was an alcoholic. and possibly this was just her trying to cope with the many years of hardship they actually had faced over those 15 years. And this can be even seen in an obituary for the Nenagh News, which also described that she had a long and tedious illness that she bore throughout with the utmost patience and resignation. And what's even more interesting about this obituary is that it states that she's buried in Lisbonny Cemetery in Nenagh, but her husband Philip, who died in 1899, is buried in Killarwan outside Nenagh. And this again suggests the fact that maybe he converted and became a Protestant, and that's why they're buried in separate cemeteries. Again, another mystery to this family. But the only bit of comfort in reflecting on this is that Julia will be spared from seeing 3 of her sons go to war once again. Because a few months after her death, you had then the First World War. And this saw the Hennessey brothers, who were in the regular armies in South Africa, such as Oscar and Edgar, being sent to fight in the front, but then also introduced a new generation of military soldiers following calls to enlist. And this included Oscar's brother-in-laws, the Dorn family. So Edward Clement Dorn was a chemist in Galway, and then in early 1915 he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and was assigned to the Anglia medical ship. And sadly on the 17th of November 1915, the ship was struck by a German torpedo off the English Channel, and reports originally stated that Edward had managed to escape and survive the ship. However, a letter written by a private groundlord off Summerhill, Nenagh, to Michael and Mary Dorn told a different story, that Edward was seen clinging on the side of that ship as it was sinking, and when the soldiers looked temporarily away and then looked back, he had disappeared, and it was said that he sadly was brought down with the ship as it sunk. His body was never recovered, but he is remembered on a memorial in Holbrook Cemetery, and he is an official casualty of the First World War. But despite his death, it appeared that his father Michael still encouraged his other son, Fred Dorn, to join the army. And in December 1916, he joined the Labour and Army Service Corps, which he continued to serve until his discharge in May 1919. His reason for this was to seek employment. And around this time, Fred Dorn emigrated to Liverpool and joined the Liverpool Police as a constable. And possibly one of the motivations for this at the time was that the British Army capacity reduced from 3.5 million in 1918 down to 370,000 by 1920. So perhaps he made a decision to get out before he was put out. And then going back to their in-laws, Oscar Hennessey, he arrived with the Liverpool Regiment to France around February 1915, and one letter that he wrote to his wife Agnes was published in the Nenagh Guardian, and he described how the Germans would be regularly bombarding their trenches, firing machine guns, and he concluded that it was hellish. And months after he wrote this letter at the Battle of Festubert, Oscar went on to no man's land to rescue some of his wounded friends of the Liverpool Regiment, and in doing so, while under heavy fire, he was hit by an explosive bullet in the right arm, which caused a significant physical injury to him that he would carry for the rest of his life. And as a result of his injury, he was sent to recover at the convalescent home in Whitworth, Manchester, and it can be seen there in this photograph on the bed marked in the centre of X. But his actions in Festubert did not go unrecognised, because on the 19th of August 1916, he was awarded the Military Cross as stated in the London Gazette for his actions that day. And then a decision was made in Nenagh to honour him. And it was this event that got me interested in the whole story of the Hennessey family in the first place. And it took place on the 6th of September in Nenagh Tennis Lawn Club. And it was organised by prominent individuals such as Lord Donnelly, whose own son was killed in 1914, and Miss Tora Trench, who ran the local Red Cross organisation. And 1,000 people attended this event in the town. And a special gold watch was subscribed and paid for the townspeople and presented to Oscar. They commended him on his bravery, and like his brother Bertie being a modest soldier, he essentially summarised and said that you must be prepared, if necessary, to give your life, and that was a feeling which animated the khaki And furthermore, even regimental magazines such as the Command Gazette kind of glorified his actions, caricatures were done of him, and he became quite a famous legend with the Liverpool Regiment. Then going on to his brother, Edgar. Edgar was 18 when the South War ended, and he continued to serve in the Highlander Regiment. He was in India for quite a while, and then around 1908 they returned to Scotland, and he was stationed in Aberdeen. And what's very interesting to note was on Ancestry about 2 years ago, I was contacted by a person who said that she believed her great-granduncle was possibly the son of Edgar Hennessey, and she had paperwork to show this. So the Scotland's People's website shows an Edgar Hennessey being born in 1909 in Aberdeen district, and the father being a soldier of the 1st Battalion Going Highlanders. And there was even a court case about trying to get maintenance payments and alimonies for Edgar Hennessey Jr. And his service record, which I got from the National Archives, proves that he was indeed in Aberdeen around this time, because he was actually court-martialed for neglect of duty while on post and severely reprimanded for this. So again, when you're researching family history, you never know what you're going to find. And he then arrived with the Highlanders to France actually in October of 1914. He was wounded at the Battle of Lewes with a gunshot wound to the arm. He was sent away for recovery, and upon this then he returned to the front and continued to serve as a sergeant major. He was then again wounded at the Battle of Arras. Again, he recovered from his wounds and returned to the trenches and continued to serve in France and Belgium up until 1919. Then went to India and finally back to Scotland in 1921, where he was discharged on the 21st of October. And then it was around this time Edgar decided to settle down, and then a week after his discharge he married Martha Wilson, the daughter of a deceased barrister. So Edgar never returned to Ireland, his place of birth, to that, because he probably now considered Scotland, which was the birthplace of the Highlander Regiment, his kind of new family and heritage and identity, and that's why he decided to stay there. And despite his discharge from the army, the army was not done with him, because in 1925 he was employed by them to be an army recruiter in Glasgow, and that's something he'd end up doing for the next 28 years. Then finally, during the First World War, you had the youngest brother, and this would be his first war, Julian Hennessey. So Julian completed his education at the Hibernian School, and he was actually, unlike his brothers, he didn't join his father's regiment. He actually joined the Royal Army Service Corps, as he was actually sought for by the command. And what's very unusual about Julian is, when I got his service record from the National Archives, unlike Edgar's, which only had a few pages, his service record had 108 pages in total, going back over the years, and included some very interesting facts, such as he was in both the British and Egyptian army, as he was assigned to the supplies division of the Service Corps that would have supplied all the troops going to Mesopotamia fighting against the Ottoman Empire that joined the war. And he was stationed a lot in Cairo, but he was also commended for his actions during the Darfur expedition and was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal in 1917. And he actually was trying to become an officer in the army. And this photograph on the bottom right corner is actually a uniform of the Royal Irish Regiment, as he actually was assigned to them in March of 1980. Shortly after his appointment to the regiment on the 9th of March, he received a gunshot wound to the leg during battle, and as a result, he was sent away to be treated. And then he never returned to the front, and instead was sent to the Artillery Corps. And even more interestingly, between September 1919 to April 1920, he was actually stationed in the Baltic Sea just outside Russia, along with a group of soldiers as part of an expedition. Possibly these soldiers were to monitor the situation that was going on in Russia at the time, following the aftermath of the 1917 October Revolution and the fall of the Tsar's regime. So finally, Julian did return to England around May 1920, was assigned to Kensington Barracks, and then he was actually going to be enrolled to a cadet school to become an officer, but sadly he never got to complete his education. He became ill while stationed in Hounslow, and on the 31st of August 1920, at the age of 29, he died from illness, having been admitted there 3 weeks previously. So Julian was unmarried and never had any children, and his next of kin was his eldest brother Gus. So Julian was buried in Hounslow in Brentwood Cemetery in an unmarked grave. And then in 2021, I was contacted by the historian for the Duke of York Kent, who was researching ex-Hibs who died in the war. He informed me that since Julian died in 1920, he would be eligible for a Commonwealth War grave as he was serving. And once proof was got from Hounslow that he indeed was a serving soldier when he died, they confirmed that within 2 to 3 years he would get a Commonwealth headstone. And in September, a few months ago, I actually did a trip to London. And on the 19th of September, at 9:30 in the morning, I walked into the cemetery for the first time, not knowing where I'd find the headstone. And by pure coincidence that morning, they were actually erecting the brand new Commonwealth headstone for Julian Hennessey at his grave. I had no idea they were going to be there. They didn't know I was going to be there. And they could not believe a guy from Tipperary had shown up that particular morning. If I had went a day earlier, if I went the day after, I would have missed such a moment as this. And this definitely was a highlight of my time there in London. And just like his brother Charlie, he's buried nearby a chapel. So then going back to Ireland, Oscar never returned to the front as a result of his injuries. So he did a lot of garrison duties in the UK, where he lived with his wife Agnes and son Edward. But he did always consider Nenagh to be his native place, as he grew up in the barracks there. And it was in October 1919 there that his daughter Eileen Agnes was born. And Eileen was born there 20 years after her grandfather Philip had died in the same building. And then on the 2nd of February 1920, as a result of his injuries, he was officially discharged from the army, now being a pensioner. But his time in Nenagh was not to be easy. Despite being seen as a hero in 1916 and the whole family, the stories being told, family members told me that one night, Sunday in 1920, the family had to suddenly leave Nenagh because they'd been threatened with death by the local IRA. And this was not only because Oscar was an ex-soldier, but also because he apparently used to hang a Union Jack flag outside his home in Summerhill. And a similar account can be seen with the Brownlow family of Summerhill, whose own father, a retired OAC sergeant, was threatened with death and had to leave Nenagh overnight. So Oscar and the family ended up settling in New Ross, County Wexford, and even to this day, I'm not entirely sure why, of all places on, did they pick New Ross. There was no family connections or anything. Perhaps he had friends from the Liverpool Regiment that lived there and encouraged him to come and stay there. Or perhaps it was considered a safe place for ex-servicemen in Ireland. And the family would live there for several years, and he would even take part in the local branch of the Irish Legion of ex-servicemen in armistice defence and so on. And eventually in 1926, the family eventually did go to Liverpool and live there for good. And the connection with Liverpool was his in-law, Fred Dorn, who was there as a Liverpool police constable. What's interesting to note is that Oscar's in-laws, Michael and Mary Dorn, despite what happened to their son and daughter-in-law, decided to remain in Nenagh, and it was only in 1922 they finally decided to leave. And perhaps this was to do with the beginning of the Civil War, where even Nenagh was becoming a very dangerous place, such as the Battle of Nenagh. And we mentioned that Michael Dorn worked at the North Tipperary Club, and the North Tipperary Club was severely damaged during the Battle of Nenagh, as compensation records in the National Archives in Dublin show, and perhaps this finally influenced his decision to leave Nenagh for good. So Michael Dorn died in 1931 in Liverpool, and the reason I want to mention his death is that his obituary was published in the Nenagh Guardian, and it mentioned that the chief mourners at the funeral in Everton Cemetery included Oscar Hennessey, and this would be the last time ever in the lifetime of the Hennesseys they would be mentioned in a Nenagh newspaper, as all members at that stage of the Hennessey family were gone from Nenagh, having been there since the mid-1880s. So then you have the next generation of those in the army. So going back to the eldest brother Gus, he was the only one of the Hennessey brothers to actually have an officer rank in the army. And in 1927, he was discharged with the rank of second lieutenant. and his 3 children were all grown up at this stage. His only daughter, Margaret, married a Protestant called William Ganley from Dublin in England, and she actually returned with William and resided in Monkstown in Dublin. And they would go on then to have a daughter called Clodagh. And then you have the 2 sons, and then you see this whole concept, what's known as endo-recruitment. And this is when you had the sons of soldiers continuing that family tradition of military service. And this certainly applies to Gus's 2 sons. And what's unusual to them, unlike Philip's sons, is that they actually went to Sandhurst Academy in England to be trained as officers. And because of their early lives in India, the advantage for them was then they were commissioned to the Indian Army. So the eldest son was called Ernest Albert Reynolds Hennessey, and you can see from this name that was a direct tribute to his late uncle, killed in South Africa in Reynolds. So Bertie was appointed on the 1st of February 1923 to the Punjab Regiment, and his service records from the British Library show that he was a very good officer, had excellent potential. But then, sadly, that was not to last. On the 12th of April 1936, Captain Hennessey was found dead in his hotel room in Bombay, India. And for many years, the family were told that he had actually taken his own life, which they found very difficult to believe, on account that he was actually engaged to be married and he had a very good career in the army. It was only 10 years later, following the end of the Second World War, that a friend of his from the regiment visited the Hennessey family and told them what happened. That he actually had an earache infection at the time. He went to the local army hospital to get treated, but because of lack of sanitation, lack of staff, an orderly gave him penicillin for the treatment, which he had an allergic reaction to and died. And sadly, his death could have been avoided in that way, and the family could have avoided that grief of that very poignant alternative that was told to them. Then you had the youngest, who was known as Philip James Hennessey. He was originally appointed to Lancashire Fusiliers in 1924 and eventually to the Balloch Regiment. And he had a different type of review to how he was as an officer. And an annual review by his superiors depicted that he did not have sufficient moral character to take a hold of himself. But he was only one of the 2 brothers that got to serve in the Second World War. He was stationed in Abyssinia and Eritrea, which is northern part of Africa, kind of around Ethiopia and even Sudan. And he was discharged from the army in 1943. Memoirs by his niece state that he had injuries in the war, and that's how he resorted to drinking regularly. However, his service record shows that he actually struggled with alcoholism for many years, and that was the reason for his discharge from the army at that time. So going back then to Oscar and England during the Second World War. So Oscar actually volunteered to join the Home Guard, and he was with the West Derby Civil Defence, the 86th and 88th Battalion, and he absolutely loved it, as his daughter would later recall. And despite being in the 60s, he continued to serve in the army, and because he now saw England as his new home. And then his brother Edgar was up in Scotland, carried out a role of recruiting soldiers from Glasgow to join and serve in the army. And perhaps when Second World records become digitised, we might see his name at the bottom of the service record for place of attestation. But sadly, Oscar's family were not to escape a tragedy during the war, another casualty. On the night of the 7th to 8th of May 1941, at Whitechapel Street in Liverpool, Constable Fred Dorman was on duty, and there was bombing going on that night by the German Luftwaffe, and he was killed by a building that collapsed on him from a bomb. And his niece Irene later recalled in an interview with the London Museum of Liverpool that he actually came to the house a few hours before he died to warn them not to leave the house because there was bombing and to stay safe. And little did she know that would be the last time that she would see him. So then, and what's even interesting actually about Fred is that his police helmet a couple of years ago turned up at a car boot sale somewhere in England, where someone must have recovered it from the rubble site and held it as a souvenir. And it was actually handed into the Liverpool Museum and was put on display as part of the Spirit of the Blitz exhibition, where it still is to this day. And then Oscar's son, just like Gus's son, carried on that tradition of military service and a call to fight. And during the Second World War, he served in his father's regiment, the Liverpool Regiment, and was stationed in Asia. And he actually, in 1946, was recommended for the British Empire Medal for his actions in Rangoon when he was assigned to the headquarters there. And only 1,200 people were ever recommended for this particular medal. And then just like some of the daughters and sisters in the military family, Irene followed that same tradition where she married an officer, a soldier in the army. And she married by pure coincidence a man by the name of Edward Hennessey. And you can see from this, he had a different spelling in the surname. Their wedding took place in 1945, and even the newspapers at the time had to emphasise that there was no family relation at all. That was just a pure coincidence. And then she would spend the next couple of years travelling with him around England when he was assigned to different garrisons. And just like his mother Irene and her aunt Margaret, who was the wife of Gus, she kind of would have had an understanding and preparation of what it was entailed when you married a soldier and all the travelling involved and all that. So then going back to the eldest brother Gus, so during the Second World War, it could be suggested that because of the dangerous situation in England with the bombing, Gus and Margaret decided to leave England and go to Ireland because Ireland was neutral during the war. And they actually ended up settling in Dublin, where their daughter and son-in-law resided. And they lived in Bellevue Villa in Dundrum, along with their son, retired Major Philip Hennessey. And a memoir by Gus's granddaughter states that things were very tense in that Hennessey household on account of his alcoholism, and that Gus and his son Philip would not really on speaking terms. And sadly, in 1950, at the age of 45, Philip died as a result of complications as to do with his drinking. And he was unmarried and did not have any children. Then Gus himself died suddenly in Easter of 1953, followed by his wife Margaret in 1959. And then finally in 1983, his last surviving child, Margaret Gammy Hennessey, died. And they were all buried together in Dean's Green Cemetery in Dublin. And again, very unusual that Eileen, despite being married, was buried separately from her husband, William Ganley. Perhaps it's to do with the fact that he was Protestant, she was a Catholic. But what's really interesting about this headstone is under Gus's name, it had that he was of Roscrea, County Tipperary, even though he was born in Dundalk and grew up in Nenagh. This could again add a piece to the puzzle of the Hennessey family that perhaps in the early 1880s, the first few years of Gus's life, the family lived in Roscrea when he was with the King's County Rifles. So then we have Edgar Hennessey, who was in Scotland. So we heard about what he did during the Second World War as an army recruiter, and it wasn't until 1953 that he finally retired from this position, where he was known fondly as Sergeant Tim. And sadly, his wife had predeceased him when she passed away in 1942, but they had a son and daughter. And despite the fact that he was an army recruiter, Edgar was known ironically for saying that no son of mine will ever serve in the British Army. And because of physical injuries that his son Peter sustained during his childhood, he was never considered medically fit to actually serve if he had wanted to. So I was in contact in Cyprus with the granddaughter of Edgar, who was the daughter of Edgar's daughter, the granddaughter of Edgar. And she recalls that in 1959 she remembers her childhood travelling with the family to the local hospital in Glasgow where Edgar had been admitted, and sadly he passed away before their arrival. And his cause of death actually appeared to be associated with withdrawal from alcoholism. Again, seeing a bit of pattern recovery suggests that maybe alcoholism went in some part of the Hennessey family through different generations. So Edgar Hennessey is buried in an unmarked grave in St. Kentigern's Catholic Cemetery in Glasgow. And then we have the children of Oscar Hennessey. So what happened to them after the war? So Edward Hennessey actually, before the war, was married to a lady and they had a son together. And by all accounts, they had a very hostile relationship and they actually got divorced in 1939 and he went off to war. And then after his service, he ended up becoming a police officer with the colonial police and was stationed in an island called Sarawak in North Borneo off the coast of Singapore. And these photographs actually show him with this particular lady here. Her name was Ingeborg, who was a German national from Hamburg. And this certainly must have been very controversial to his father Oscar, who was a devout Catholic, having divorce in the family at that time, and particularly the fact that he married a German national only a few years after the war between Britain and Germany had come to an end, that claimed the life of Fred Dorn. So they lived in Sarawak for about 10 years, and then the 1960 shipping record shows that they went to Hamburg in Germany, where she was from, and it states that his intended place of residence was going to be South Africa with the civil service. However, he never made it to South Africa. On the 15th of March 1961, he was found dead on the River Astrod in Hamburg, and to this day it's unknown what happened. Was a foul play involved? Was it accidental, or had he taken his own life? And his wife Ingeborg Hennessey would remain in Hamburg for the rest of her life. And then his sister Irene, she passed away in 2005, and she was predeceased by her husband Edward Hennessey, who died in 1978. And I mentioned earlier that she had done an interview with the Museum of Liverpool back in 2003, and this was to do with the Spirit of the Blitz, and it's an excellent source to read the transcript because she talks about her early life in Ireland, about being a new Ross, about why the family finally decided to leave. And it was said that her mother Agnes one day said to her that they just had enough of this nonsense. And I think it was to do with the divisions in Irish communities and that kind of hostility that still prevailed among ex-servicemen. And furthermore, she also gave accounts about the night that Fred Dorn was killed and how much of a loss he was to the Hennessey family. So finally then, what happened to Oscar Hennessey himself? So he survived the Second World War. His wife Agnes died shortly afterwards in 1948. And he definitely had tragedy in his life. He lost his wife and then his son died in 1960. But while he was in Liverpool, he was regularly involved in regimental associations, and he was even the vice president of the Merseyside South African Veterans Association. And one of the last events he would do in his life was actually attend a special armistice event in Windsor Park in London, attended by the Queen Mother Winston Churchill, to mark the 60th anniversary of the end of the South African War, which also took place on the week of his 80th birthday. And this photograph in the bottom right corner from the Liverpool Echo, he is pictured second to the right, and this is the last known photograph of Oscar. And a newspaper would describe that Oscar was always proud of his Irish heritage, that he always upheld his heritage of Ireland with great esteem, but never allowed that to supersede his loyalty to the land of adoption, and yet he was always a kingsman in the true sense of the word. So Oscar anyway had survived the South African War, he survived the First World War, he survived the War of Independence in Ireland and the Irish Civil War, and he survived the Second World War. So did Oscar get to live to as old as he could and pass away peacefully in sleep? Unfortunately not. On the 25th of October 1962, outside St. Matthew's Church, down the road from where he lived, he was struck by a motor vehicle and was killed instantly. He was 80 years of age, and he was buried with full military honours by the Liverpool Regiment Association in Everton Cemetery, where his father-in-law Michael and Mary Dorn and his wife Agnes are buried to this day. And he was the last living brother of the Hennessey family. So I mentioned earlier that there were 8 children that Philip and Julia had. We've now seen what happened to the 6 brothers. So what happened to the 2 daughters of Philip and Julia Hennessey? So unfortunately, little is actually known about their early lives. So the eldest was Nora Ethel Hennessey. We know from the 1901 census that she was a pupil at the Drummond Institute in the Phoenix Park, which was the institution for the daughters of soldiers. and they would have been taught things such as domestic duties, how to cook, how to do laundry, all of that should they be employed in a household. And we then found her back in Nenagh in 1911, where she was employed as a milliner in the town, living with her mother and sister. And then for the next 28 years, nothing is known about her. She's not on the 1921 UK census, but maybe with the digitisation next year of the 1926 Irish census, we might find a bit of a clue. But I then finally found her in the 1939 UK and Wales register, where she's actually living in Blackburn, and she was a retired cook. So Nora never married or had any children, and she died there in 1943, and she was buried in Pleasanton. I was able to confirm this was indeed Nora because her burial record states that an Oscar Hennessey paid for the burial. And then I was always wondering then what happened to the youngest daughter, Mary Hennessey. And Mary Hennessey being such a quite common name, I made a request on Facebook genealogy groups about would anyone have any information about Mary Vincent Hennessey, which was such an unusual name. And finally, one day someone got back and said that there was a Mary Vincent Hennessey who got married in Australia. And I was able to go onto the Australian genealogy website and find her marriage record, which was indeed Gladys Hennessey, as it stated that she was born in Nenagh and her parents were Philip Hennessey and Julia Carney. And furthermore, I was able to go backwards where the Australian archives had her immigration record, and it actually revealed that she'd been working as a children's nurse in Hampstead in London. And the descendants of the family would later tell me that when her mother Julia died, she was raised by a convent, and perhaps this is where she learned the skills to then become a children's nurse, where she then emigrated from Ireland and went to Hampstead. But then she finally decided to go and emigrate to Australia. So the Hennessey family now, you had a lot of migration because of life in the army, but now you had an Irish person emigrate from Ireland for reasons of employment. And it was while she was emigrating to Australia on the ship, she became acquainted with an officer on the ship called Louis Albert West. They fell madly in love, and upon their arrival in Melbourne, they got married. They would remain in Australia for several years, and then around 1934, they returned to his home parish of Leamington in Hampshire, where they would have one son and daughter. And Mary Vincent West would pass away in 1984, and her husband was survived by 12 years, and when he died at the age of 100, very interesting about Louis Albert West, he did an oral interview with the Imperial War Museum in London, and to this day you can listen to it on the website, and it actually goes into all of his life about a Navy officer in the First and Second World War. So, and I also furthermore found out that Gladys' daughter Dorothy actually tried to visit Nenagh in 2018 to find out more about her mother, and sadly at the time very little information was available, and she died a few months later. And it was only a year after her death that I finally found all this information and researched his family, and that is always something I will regret. So Gladys Hennessey was the final child of Philip and Julia Hennessey to pass away. So I guess just to conclude this evening, what to take away from tonight. So definitely from seeing there's been a lot of tragedy in the life of the Hennessey family. Some as we can see was avoidable, other just unfortunate was because of the times that were there and the lack of medicine and just the events that went on. And we can see a generation of military service that lasted for over 100 years. And it's also important to note that it wasn't just the men that were impacted by life in the army. You had the wives, the daughters and sisters that were just as impacted by them and just as involved. And like many Irish families, the Hennesseys kind of became forgotten in the narrative of this new Irish history. For many years they were forgotten. And all this research in the dissertation has finally helped to revive that memory and tell the story to this day that had become unknown. And I guess one thing as well finally to say is that the Hennessey is just one of many military families of Tipperary. This information was unknown about them. So if you were to take a military family in Borrisley, for instance, to find out about them, how far could you go with them? Because you never know what you're going to discover. So that's all for this evening anyway. I just want to thank you again all for coming. I want to thank the Borrisley Historical Society for having me here. And I actually bought copies of the service records, which are just over there, and I have photographs, including ones that weren't on the slides, in the photo just over there as well, if anyone would like to have a look. So yeah, I'm more than happy now to take any questions you may have, and I just want to say thank you all very much.
I just want immediately to respond by saying a very, very big thank you to Michael for an absolutely magnificent, detailed lecture. The amount of research, information that he has collated is unimaginable, unbelievable, and his slides, etc., are out of this world. You can clearly see he has an incredible passion for history, military history, etc. So Michael, thank you very, very much. And as I said, if anyone wants to make an observation or say something or ask a question, feel free. Thanks very much.